thank you. This is our space quilt. You can't quite see it from this angle, but it's
it's a lovely room.
Wow.
Yes.
Ben, it's the opposite of my podcasting space, so be gone with you.
I got envious after the watching the video yesterday of the interview and being like, oh yes, I should be in a library for my panel.
All right, we'll more or less get started.
Yeah. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Casey Blair, the Programming Director for 4th Street Fantasy, and we are here for the 2021 virtual panel, Kinging is Hard, but Not Kinging is Harder, Valorizing Collective Action, with panelists Aliette de Bodard, Intisar Khanani, Benjamin C. Kinney, Scott Lynch, and Sherwood Smith. Today's panel prompt is, individual people can accomplish a lot, but it takes a village to create systemic change. Even prophesied kings aren't doing all the work of running a kingdom on their own, but a single hero and their victories are easier to understand and champion than incremental change spread out across a community. So let's discuss ways fantasy can move away from the easy inertia of waiting and wanting kings to save us in single decisive battles. How can fantasy effectively depict communities and communal action as heroic? Specifically, how do we structure our stories so they don't reinforce the narrative that only one special person can have the power to do anything that matters, and challenge what our framework for heroism looks like? So we're going to let the panelists take it away for a while first, and then they'll start taking questions from the audience. So without further ado, let's turn it over to today's moderator, Scott Lynch.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to have everybody introduce themselves with just a basic 60 or 70 line precis of everything you've ever done, relevant degrees, addresses at which you formerly lived, etc. Or you could just do a brief bio, whatever you feel like. Starting with Aliette.
Hi, my name is Aliette de Bodard. I'm a writer of fantasy and science fiction. My pronouns are she, her. My most recent book is Fireheart Tiger, which is a sapphic romantic fantasy set in a world loosely inspired by pre-colonial Vietnam. I am on this panel for a number of reasons, but I think the most relevant fact is that a number of years ago, I wrote a very ranty essay for Uncanny about the nature of agency and how we needed to challenge that in order to write better books.
All righty. Intisar?
My name is Intisar Khanani. I also write primarily fantasy for young adults. My pronouns are she and her. And my most recent book was The Theft of Sunlight. It just came out this past March. And it's about a young woman who just decides to take on the human trafficking conspiracy or ring in her kingdom. And I'm here because my heroines usually don't save the day unless they're saving the day with a lot. So I'm really interested to be part of this panel and talk about what systemic change looks like when you're building allies instead of being a lone hero.
All righty. Thank you. And Ben?
Hi, I'm Benjamin C. Kinney. I'm a science fiction fantasy writer, a neuroscientist, and the assistant editor of the science fiction magazine Escape Pod, which in 4th Street Fantasy fashion is also a fantasy magazine, because science fiction is all a subset of fantasy. I have short stories out in many fine places. I have ones coming out next month in both Fantasy Magazine and Fireside Fiction. I'm on this panel. Maybe I have some ideas about seeing structures of academia and science and knowledge generation, and how those can lead to different organizational structures and different ways of centralizing and decentralizing power.
All righty. And Sherwood.
My name is Sherwood Smith, and my graduate work was in early modern Europe, where I was studying the evolution of the state. For the last 6 years, I've been immersed in the language and history of China, which I found very interesting, comparing parallel tracks as far as the evolution of the state. all my fantasy has been about the nature of power and how ordinary people can work against the tension, let's say, of the state, while acknowledging that human beings are hierarchical and there is always going to be a king, whatever you call it. I think our recent politics are pointing in that direction.
All righty. And I'm Scott Lynch. I'm the moderator of this panel. I'm the author of The Gentleman Bastard Sequence. And I've been, air quotes, coming to 4th Street, since nobody's been coming to 4th Street for 2 years now, since 2011. So 10 years of this madness. And I'm delighted to be here. My pronouns are he, him. Okay. So one of the things that I'm going to start us out with is just a brief definitional note that I sent the panel beforehand, that what we're talking about here is that we're not going to so much wander too far down the path of actual excessively literal critique of the institution of kingship itself. We're also hopefully not going to dwell upon too many specific examples of kings or not kings doing things. What we're really after is to kind of churn on the broader topic of, too narrow assessment of agency and responsibility in fiction, if that makes sense. My panel has consented, more or less. Some of you were dead silent, which I took for consent, to basically let me throw some questions at you to sort of provide our structural framework and kick things off. So I'm going to kick out the first of the questions for our panelist, which is going to go to Aliette. And Aliette, your question to commence is, as a general rule, and I promise there is a question here somewhere, even though I'm starting with an I statement. I don't want us to ever get, too prescriptive in our discussions, at least not without showing our work. So first things first, I'd like to kind of dissect our premise a little bit, and ask, why might we actually want to de-emphasize the notion of individual heroism and sort of counter-valorize community action? What do we get out of that artistically and culturally?
Okay, I'm not too sure. I mean, let me take the last bit of the question first, and then I guess we'll wander into artistically. I think, okay, by culturally, I'm going to mean within a fairly narrow framework of what I call, Western, for want of a better word, very heavily derived from the US, the UK. And so there's a centered tendency to go to one person does thing, a narrative of a chosen one, individualism, a notion of agency that is very narrow. It is the things that you do yourself, and it is in fact weak to need help, to accept help from others, to work as a team. This is really not the way that the world actually works. We are gregarious social animals, and in fact, we mostly function as communities. We have historically functions at the intersection of several communities. And, if you take even, the families, for instance, right? The nuclear family is a relatively new invention, right? We used to raise kids as part of much larger communities rather than just expecting two parents to be responsible for literally everything. So I guess I feel a little bit like an iconoclast in that I'm like, hell no, this is not how it works. And I think as an author, I have a responsibility to go wave around a book that says, hey, this is really not how it works. And I have written a book to prove that it is not how it works. More, less fascistly and a little bit more seriously, we're also storytelling animals, and pattern. We function on recognizing patterns and imposing patterns on other things. And where do we get those patterns? Actually, we get them from stories. So the things that you read become the things that you use to make sense of the world. And it's a self-perpetuating circle of we read a thing and then we see every occurrence of it in the real world and therefore assume that the thing is true. So as an artist, I feel very not individually responsible, but carrying part of a collective responsibility of making sure that there is actually a variety of stories that do a better job of reflecting the way that the world is.
Anybody want to spring anything off of that? If you like raise your hands or something in front of the camera, I'm not used to taking non-visual cues here, but go for it, Ben.
Yeah, I have two things to say on this. I'll say one and then let anyone else come in. First, as to jump off what Aliette said more directly, as a neuroscientist, I completely support everything she said here about how about these things that people are good at and people are for, that our social function and organization is one of the key things that makes humans successful, and that we are pattern finding and pattern creating creatures. This is the reason why, you see Jesus based on a piece of toast. Is like you want your brain wants things to make sense, and it writes sense in even when sense is not entirely there. And that's something that we do all the time. And everything metaphorical and implicit involves giving partial information and having the reader connect the dots of the story. And the tools that we as writers give people are the tools that they're going to carry forward in their lives. And I want to just definitely support everything I was saying about the importance of both recognizing what is real, how humans really succeed, and how important it is to portray these things accurately.
Sherwood?
I think I agree, although I'd like to put in, since we're coming at it from a writer's point of view, is that what is real is not the same for everybody. And I think story comes out of that. For one person, Jesus's face really is in the toast because it's representative of some spiritual whatever. And for the person sitting next to him, it's all bullshit. And that conflict is where story happens, because these two people have to work together.
Ben again?
Yeah, so I do, unless other people have more things to say there. One, just sort of this isn't said, another reaction to your initial question about why is this important. I feel that a lot of this sort of individual royal agency story is very tied in with the concept of a chosen one. Whether you are chosen by birthright, by royal birthright, or because you're born this way, or the American version where like chosenness is granted upon you, not hereditary, but still outside your choice. And I've always been of the opinion that this is it's a thing that encourages laziness. It's a thing that provides comfort in a lowest common denominator way, where like there's no point in doing the work of gaining expertise and capability, because what matters is whether or not you have the magic. And telling stories where what matters is whether somebody has the magic is giving people tools that support them being passive in their lives, that support them, and that I think these chosen one type narratives are very sort of anti-expertise and anti-knowledge, and that it is just good to tell stories that don't conform to that.
Intisar, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I find that a really interesting perspective, the kind of disempowering power of chosen one stories, because either you're chosen or you're not. But I think it's also interesting to kind of look at how we're defining the stories that shape us, right? So a lot of the stories I think we're thinking about right now are those hero's journey stories, right? Where you have your lone hero who is called to their quest and they go off, whether they, like to or not. And they do it alone, right? Like this is it. This is how you save the world, is you go at it alone and you lose all your support and you're strong and you face the evil villain, whoever that might be, or whatever it might be, and you save the day, and then you're kind of no longer fit for this world, and you go off to wherever you go off. And I'd like to also kind of mention that there is another. There are many other ways of telling stories, and one of them is kind of been touted as an opposite to that, which is the heroine's journey. Gail Carriger wrote a book kind of discussing it, but it was fascinating to me reading that book, because I was like, oh, this is 100% what I write. I just didn't have the language for it. But it's really about, and it's meant to be non-gendered. So for example, Carriger talks about how Harry Potter is actually a heroine's journey story. That these are people who do it not for the glory and not for something outside of themselves. They go off on their journey to do good in the world, to help someone that they care about, or to right a wrong that affects them very personally. And they complete their journey by building allies, by creating systemic change, by bringing together multiple differing groups of people in order to create a new world. And in that new world, they have a place, and there's a happily ever after. And it's really interesting to look at that as a very, and it's, I'm interrupting myself, but Harry Potter is like the ultimate chosen one story, right? But it's interesting from this other perspective of he really doesn't do it alone. Like, there is delegation of power, there's building of allies, there's Dumbledore's army and all these other things. And so I think there's levels of and nuance to these kinds of stories. I know, Aliette, you wanted to speak as well, so I'll like to hear what you have to say.
Oh, I was actually going to go through a brief history geek round. Just bringing it back 2 minutes to the monarchy, and then promise I'm not actually going to discuss the monarchy anymore. But I think part of the monarch as the chosen one and the kind of lonely, heroic kind of figure derives from the absolute monarchy, which is a thing that Louis XIV actually came up with in order to break the power of the nobility. So it's a very disempowering narrative. And I mean, look, I'm not a big fan of the nobility per se, right? But I think that you have to recognize that the origin of that myth actually, part of the origin, there's other considerations going into that, but part of the origin of that myth is really a deliberate act of, we're going to make you forget that you have ever held power, or that you have ever had any power to affect any change, because the king holds it all.
Ms. Smith, you have a hand up. Sherwood, can you hear me? Can anybody else hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sherwood, can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Or at least I can.
I can hear you too.
Crap. I'm going to go out and come in again.
Okay. All right. Sherwood will reappear in a puff of smoke in just a moment. I mean, it's interesting that I don't want to sound like I'm too judgmental, but I am judgmental. That there are these pathologies that persist in different forms. To this very day. And one of the ones that comes to mind, as we're talking about all of this is, I guess, I'm a citizen of the United States in the early 21st century, and so I'm a child of a society that has a pathological need to pick somebody to get the credit. I come from a society where, Elon Musk is the guy who builds the rockets and shoots them into space. Actually, he's got 75,000 people doing that for him, but he gets the credit. This is the world of Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, and Christopher Columbus discovered the new world. Like, what? He rowed himself across the Atlantic Ocean in a small boat with nobody else to assist him or set sails or cook the food. And I really like the point that it all,
No
it
one was here before the panel?
hello? We had a random noise. I'm sorry, viewers, as we try to summon Sherwood back into her containment circle. But no, I was struck by the notion, as Aliette said, that this was basically, all part of a phenomenon that is, consciously or unconsciously designed to make people who are not in the driver's seat, feel that they are, that you are worthless, you are powerless, you will never get the credit, you will never receive the benefit of anything, and you might as well just live with that because that's the natural order of things. Sherwood, can you hear us?
Yes, I finally can hear again. I don't know what happened. I wanted to put in a real quick comment that actually Louis XIV was not the first to tame the nobility. He was the most successful. And he did it by building Versailles and making everything about his personal charisma. He had the charisma to carry it off. Others had tried it and were not as successful, except for the ones who approached it through brutality and fear. Moving on.
All righty.
And I think that's interesting because we get into personalities there, which from the storyteller's point of view, I think readers read about kings because kings are interesting. There's only one at a time. And usually they have supported their power by display. And where we moderns find interest in storytelling is the tension pushing against kings, right? So go ahead, Aliette.
Oh, no, I was just actually going to bounce off on what you said, is that there was a very interesting science experiment, which I unfortunately do not remember the names of who performed the experiment. But so if you put a narcissist personality into, you take teenagers, I believe they were teenagers, and you put a narcissist personality in, and you put them in charge, right? And you give them something to do. The group that had the narcissistic personality is very happy about what they did. But in fact, they didn't do as well as the other group, the one that didn't have the personality in it.
Isn't that American politics for the last 4 years in a nutshell?
It's a lot of situations in a nutshell, right? But I find
narcissists are like the Old Bay seasoning of American politics.
Yeah.
If only we had a neuroscientist.
Yes, I was going to say, to bring it actually back to something Aliette said earlier as well, one of the best predictors of group performance, like they've done studies where, you divide people up and you give them these standardized tasks. And what matters most is essentially the best social skills within each group. Like the person with which group has the social skills of the peak social skills person is what matters more than people's, quote unquote intelligence. We won't get into that. That's another panel for sure. And how the way this ties to us humans being these social creatures where coordinating between us is key, but it's not about the competence of people in the classic getting things done sense. It's about the ability to get people to work together. And that's a great, I hadn't been aware of that thing with narcissists, but it's a great counterpoint to this where you can do the social skills in a misleading way and make everyone think they are doing well without actually succeeding by leaning too hard into the social side.
They're not actually being a very effective leader. They're making you think they are, right?
They're just really happy with what they've done. Yeah, I feel called out. Hi. It's us. All righty. Well, I'm going to push us along just a little bit because you people are being too interesting. And I'm going to throw a question at Intisar this time. So this is a question that touches on both conception and on craft. If you draw a line between the two, you may not wish to, but what the hell, I wrote the question. So how do we successfully portray systemic problems or systemic challenges in fiction without actually just coming out and bluntly stating in as many to the words, I speak the English good well, yes. Without just actually coming out and bluntly stating to the reader, hey, this problem is systemic, double underlined. I mean, at 4th Street, we often tell ourselves that we don't want to simply, fling too many anvils at our readers. So how does one paint a picture that sinks in? Although it is also a perfectly valid counter question, is subtlety even a virtue in these cases? So yeah, every single point, please dissect over the next 7 hours. Go ahead.
Well, I think I'll start by saying I don't think there's a problem with occasionally being obvious. I think you can successfully fling one anvil. So just pick your anvil, right? Like know what it is that that you need to address head on if you need to. So like I mentioned, I have this book that came out, and the main drive is addressing human trafficking in the fantasy kingdom. And it would be really hard to be subtle about this. So my character's best friend's sister is abducted by slavers. That's how we know it's a systemic problem. Like, oh, we have a discussion. Like, why is no one doing anything about this? Beyond that, so you can be obvious. It's okay if it's the driving force of your story. It's okay to address it head on, but you don't. I agree that you don't want to do that with everything that you have in your story. There's we get down into, basic questions of craft, like, showing, not telling. But you can also think about layered interactions. Like, so for example, if you are writing a character with a disability, or you're writing a character who is of a different race from the overarching society that they live in, what are the microaggressions that they're dealing with? What are the things they deal with that they recognize are happening around them? They may not even discuss it, but as a reader, you pick up on cues. You begin to realize that that there are that they can reflect on the anvils that exist that are not being addressed straight on. So I think that's another way of approaching it. You see a lot of stories where we can draw an understanding of what's wrong with certain systemic beliefs or problems from how well it's actually woven into the plot of the story. So one book that comes to mind is The 10,000 Doors of January by Alex Harrow. And it's a scathing portrayal of capitalism and colonialism. And it's, as well as how those are built on racism and on class, at the same time as being this fascinating story about magical doors and first love and family, among other things. So some things are hit head on, some things are, you're there, it's in the details of the story. I don't know if this quite answers what you're asking.
No, it's getting in the right direction.
Yeah, so I guess if your characters are dealing with or living under systemic problems, even if they don't name it, your readers will recognize it. And I think that part of this is trusting your readers to be observant and be in the world of your story and recognize what's happening around them. And not every reader is going to get it, but a lot of them will. And hopefully, if they're talking to each other, they'll explore it further.
Yeah, how do you the question of, how do you work around a reader for whom the obvious just will not sink in? Like that is another panel entirely. And sometimes you just have to accept sometimes you're not going to reach everybody. You're just not. You don't have that power, so don't fret about it. Some people are going to misconstrue the clearest, plainest thing on the page. Does anybody want to spring off of what Intisar's been saying? Aliette.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so I'm going to talk about my own books because it's a little easier to actually talk about how I planned them and how I wrote them, because I think this is partly a craft question and it's a little harder to analyze.
It's okay. I give you formal permission to talk about your own books. None of you went charging. You've got a 20-minute window at the opening of the panel. If nobody goes charging toward in my books, then you can talk about them all you want.
But I mean, so I wrote Dominion of the Fallen, which is a 19th century Gothic Paris set of books, which deals with a very classist and racist society. And part of the way that I got this, there were a couple of things I used to get across the complexity of what was happening. I picked different characters who had different stakes in the system. Right, so one of the viewpoint characters is like the head of one of the magical factions, and she's having it rather good, right? I mean, obviously her faction is falling to pieces around her, but objectively speaking, she's one of the most privileged people in this whole setup. I got a middling indifferent character who's halfway up the hierarchy of people, who's like benefiting from the system, but in a sort of more passive sort of way, right? Not, okay, it's nice to be in a house, and then loses that status about halfway through the book. So you also get to see how going outside the established order soon becomes a problem. And then I got someone who basically got the raw end of the deal any which way you picked it, because he was a Vietnamese conscript who'd been brought into Paris and who was outside the system altogether. And the system really did not like that at all. The other thing, so having fundamentally different and conflicting views about what to do about the whole thing, right? Obviously, the person who's at the top of the system is like, we could reform the system, that'd be nice. And the one who's at the bottom is like, nah, set it on fire with extreme prejudice. Now, that's the only way to be sure. And by the end of the series, what I did to imply that, you know, all the problems were not going to be solved actually in a day was have them at a new point where things had changed, but this was just the beginning of change, right? So in the aftermath of what had happened, power had reconfigured and people were moving towards another balance. And the implication at that point was, it's going to be long. It's going to involve a lot of people, and it's going to involve a lot of talking and a lot of fighting, even more talking and fighting than during the series, obviously. What Intisar was saying about layers as well, right? I had multiple layers of multiple people that you saw in passing during the scenes who were doing other things and who were having different social functions in different social places and different problems, which may or may not have impacted the narration. It kind of gets across the idea that you had those whole communities that were involved to different degrees in what was happening. And I mean, and you had characters actually arguing about, okay, well, this solution is not going to work because, right? And this solution is, I tried to show people trying to talk it through, right? And try to go like, well, not always rationally. I'm not saying that everybody got around the table and said everything is fine, right? But I tried to show people trying to come up with solutions that took the interests of several people at the table. In fact, at one point there was one character who went like, okay, this is with us or we're not, you know, we're just not on. So don't know if that was always successful, but I think that's part of what I was trying to say with those books as well was, okay, you're not going to change a society like that, which is deeply problematic, but it's not just going to be solved that way. To me, I guess that's part of what I find interesting in world building.
Intisar?
I think it's a really important kind of point to just sit with as a writer, is that so many of our stories, even if we're trying to, you know, create these systemic change, we're like at the end of the story, it's all changed, it's all good, and that is again not how the world works, as you said, Aliette. These are I think it's very disempowering, especially for young people, but for anyone to read these stories where everything's fixed at the end and then you go into real life and nothing is ever conclusively fixed, right? And so I think it's, as authors, we have a responsibility to, you know, yes, give our readers some closure, some sense of success, whatever that might look like in our story worlds, but also recognizing that like these kinds of systemic change, that's your life work, you know, and it's going to go up and down for the rest of your life, and you're just going to have to do it. Or not necessarily you, but like your team of people, that it is work that it gets passed on. And in different phases of our life, we will do different amounts of work on different things, and our focus will change. But these are all normal parts of living. But really that recognition that that you don't just do the one thing, pass that one piece of legislation, and now the problem is fixed. Like it doesn't work that way.
Anybody else? Sherwood.
Yeah, real quick, just adding on to what Intisar and Aliette have said. I think, and I'm speaking not just as a writer, but as a teacher of junior high and high school kids who socially have already been immersed in the fact that they feel powerless, but also as they become engaged in the world, they see an election turn out badly or a terrorist act or something, and they feel helpless. And one of the things that I think stories can do, as well as people can say, is change happens one decision at a time. And it can be ordinary people who get together and make that decision. Together, they become powerful. And we can get that through reading books like the ones you were talking about.
Did you have anything you wanted to add, Ben?
No, I think you all have covered it very, very well and better than I could. So.
All righty. Well, that's good because I'm about to put you on the spot with our next question. So, how does healthy and effective, unquote, group activity in a real world sector like the sciences or academia, and I know I'm going to stop myself here because a bunch of academics just went healthy and effective and, spit their coffee.
Real world.
So remember, we're talking a little bit theoretical here. How does it differ from the classic narrative of the lone genius, the brilliant iconoclast, the one hero who knows what to do and does it when the time is right, damn the torpedoes, damn the bureaucrats. Why should these dramatically interesting modes of behavior not actually be encouraged in healthy communities? And how do you make a less authority-focused vision of community, engaging in fiction?
Yeah, I mean, the coming at it from these sort of lessons of things that I've seen in science and academia, it's worth noting that, like, yes, this is not the way things typically function in most settings, but they can provide us models that we as writers can take into other settings and use their things. There's two kind of big things, and one of them is about how a scientist becomes sort of successful and renowned and famous. Like, you want somebody who's 20 years later, everyone believes the thing that they came up with, and everyone uses their ideas. And the way you get to that point is by training people, is by having students and making them succeed. You want the best way to get your influence out into the world is through the success of the people who are influenced by you. You want to have students who will go and be successful in their own right, and they'll take things in new directions, but they're going to be carrying forward your ideas and your impulse and your framing and your perspective on the world. And one of the real ways to succeed in science is by you can gain power by decentralizing power. And one way in which this fails, labs that get in trouble for like falsifying data and making stuff up and like big scientific misconduct scams often come down to, the primary investigator, the person at the head of the pyramid was too monarchical, to use a word. Not just in the both sort of removed and hard to communicate with, but also somebody who you couldn't disappoint. What happens is that junior people go, oh boy, if I show these results to the boss, he's going to get pissed. Maybe I'll show him these different results. And by feeling like they have to please him because he is the person with all the power, you end up creating this edifice that is going to totally crash as soon as anyone from the outside notices what is happening. And that's happens time and again in science.
Aliette?
Yes. Can I put my other hat on, which I did not? I did not signal this other hat at the beginning of the panel, but my day job is in systems engineering, and so I've
Hat yourself up, systems engineer.
Yes, I'm hatching myself up as a complex systems person, and I mean, I'm going to echo what Ben said about the fact that we don't really do lone geniuses. In fact, lone geniuses are like major like casualties, major risk factors, because what happens when the person goes sick or decides to take 3 weeks holiday and did not actually leave a clear action plan or clear transferable stuff? You're fucked. So it's more, I mean, it's a critical risk. And part of the way that, those projects work is that you get concurrent expertise from multiple people that you need to wrangle together. And it's a matter of getting people to talk to each other, to communicate with each other in an effective way, and to work together in an effective way. There's very little room for the antics of somebody who decides to go off in the corner and do something. And one of the, I mean, it's semi-recent example of innovation that went through is a teamwork, right? You have to, it's not, I did this in my garage and look, it's awesome and we're going to use it immediately, right? You do have to go through several layers of, we did this, it's working, we did this, it's working. And it can feel frustrating to feel that, your work has to get approved by multiple committees. But at the end of the day, the software gets put on automated trains that are going to be responsible for the safety of like thousands and millions of people, right? You kind of don't want a crash, which is what happened my first day on the job. Nothing to do with the system. It turned out actually human error is responsible for most of these, actually. But it's again worth noting that the world does emphatically, in fact, not work in that way. And some of the science fiction works that describe like those big engineering projects where they build a space station have me going, really? Oh, really? Okay. Well, that should be interesting.
You are summoning so many firefighting related rants from the depths of my own experience before I explode in that respect. I will rant for a brief period of time, but I just want to give Intisar and Sherwood a chance to say something if you wanted to comment on the current topic thread.
Sure. I actually I have another hat as well, which is I worked in public health. I have my master's and spent quite a few years working on infant mortality in Cincinnati and minority health and community-based health here. And one of the really fascinating kind of approaches to improving community health that I engaged with during my time in public health was called community-based participatory action research, or just action research for short. And it's really a fantastic kind of approach. And it has been, I love it because what it does is it says your researcher, your expert, right, who usually decides what's going to be done and they do it and then they're like, here's what we learned. They're the expert as a knowledge expert, but the people that are going to make the decisions, the people who actually know what's going on in the community are community folks. The most effective, if you actually want to make change in a community, and that's where we get to questions of systemic change, right? And communities are one level and we can go up from there. But the way you make change is you give the power, or you assure the power to the people who are actually engaged in living those lives. Mm-hmm. And your academic researcher is there basically to provide the tools and the insight on how those tools can be worked and applied. And the decision making comes from the community around what are our priorities and how do we assess them. Oh, well, the expert can tell you how to assess them, but how do you make change? It's got to be in the hands of the community. It's got to be in the hands of alliances, of groups, of people working together actively on their own lives and on the things that they care about to actually make change. And so I completely forgot where I started with this. I think we were talking about the less authority focused vision. And that's where you're actually, the researcher is removing their own authority in this situation. And because they do that, the communities engaged in these kinds of action research projects have amazing levels of success because everyone is vested in working together as a team to make change in their community, and it's not top down, by definition. So that's my rant.
Alrighty. Sherwood, did you have anything?
I could actually tie it into if you want to get to that other question, because I know our time is getting tight. And I think I can keep it short too.
Well, we got a few extra minutes. We can stretch ourselves toward, the one luxury of being virtual is that we do not have to physically usher people out into the hallway in 6 minutes. So we can go just a little bit longer than usual. So go ahead.
Well, do the question, because I do want to tie it into that.
All right.
Because what Intisar said overlaps with what I was going to say in answer to the question. So I think we can tie them together.
So the last of my prepared structural questions was going to be for Sherwood. It's a question in 2 parts, and it returns us to craft, since we're always, more or less trying to return to the question of, how do we put this into fiction? How do we replicate this effect? How do we present it? So first, are there ways to dramatize community action and communal involvement in an endeavor that go beyond simply rotating the point of view more often? Because, that struck me as like the obvious way to do some of this, but there's got to be more than that. And second, when setting out to provide a more holistic or communal representation of the action, how do you avoid going too far into, a presentation of learned helplessness, or the idea that since everything is so big and complicated and systemic, nobody can take meaningful action and you might as well just weep and wail?
Okay. Approaching it from a craft point of view, which narrows it down, at least in my head, rather than talking about history, where I could blab for 6 hours. I think you can start with the easiest way to establish in a story that somebody is the king or the head or the leader is to have everybody around that person having the same reaction as they agree or show fear or show happiness after the pronunciation of, let's call it the king, just to keep it short. I think where we can break that is to show that all of those people do not have the same reaction, emotional reaction. They're not a group of robots saying, yay, king, or, oh my God, we're scared of the monster, or whatever. Each of them has different reactions, and you start the story from their reaction and the consequence of it. What action do they take? And that's of course where you get the different points of view, but you're following the action. It also breaks apart the sense of top down, where the only person being active is the king at the top and everybody else is just there as a follower. So tying it to what Intisar was saying and what Aliette was saying, and the last question is, sometimes your expert is risky when it goes against, it's a great idea and the person is very charismatic and they are an expert, but it doesn't fit that community. So how the community suddenly has to deal with this, it sounds like a great idea, but this is going to be a disaster for us. Also, coming back to craft again, there was one last point I was going to make real quick. It's interesting to me as a reader where the decision point is for ordinary people to accept what somebody has suggested or ordered or is doing, and decide to, yes, I'm going to do that too. Where does everybody come in as collective action and decide to act together? That to me is the exhilarating part of a story, particularly when everybody's been running around, doing their own thing. So that is not the chosen one who has plot armor suddenly deciding, well, we're going to have a republic. It's the people at the bottom, one by one, making the decision and working together.
Alrighty. I've just been perusing, since I remembered I can set a laptop here and look at more than one screen at a time. I have discovered how to multitask. Yay. I'm 43. I was looking at the Kinging is Hard chat on our Discord and just seeing if we had any questions as of yet. We have a request for book examples, which I think we can probably just as easily do in Discord after this. Oh, I have Casey chatting with me. I'm receiving confirmation in my earpiece that we do actually have questions. Hang on a sec. Oh, this one's pretty good. Okay. So how do you effectively promote a flat hierarchy system that gets better results when there is an established pyramidal or narcissist-driven hierarchy? And this is for in fiction and in the real world. Let's open with Ben on this one.
My first and somewhat glib answer is go build your own hierarchy elsewhere. Just work around this person, this hierarchy, create your organization somewhere else.
Kill it with fire is a perfectly acceptable organizational
it's actually
step.
Like avoid it. Just go somewhere else, build your own thing that with people who are interested in this structure. I mean, that the question, to oversimplify the question, it presupposes a organization that is awesome except for the person at the top. And if you could get rid of the person at the top, you could switch things. You could change things around to a more effective structure. But most likely, many people in this structure are used to this structure. They like this structure. They don't particularly want to change for a variety of reasons, good and bad. And you will do better in a structure. The best way to get an effective flatter organization is with people, all of whom are interested in that organizational structure. So yeah, build a new organization.
It's worth noting that people do default to that. So you are going to need to have people who are fairly invested in the concept, because if you have people who are mostly indifferent to it, and the next narcissist come around, or the next person who just wants the power, right? It's hard to overcome a combination of evolutionary reflexes and social cues, and there's a lot of baggage, basically, to put it mildly, right? So you do need to have active brain training going on. You can't just be like, oh, this sounds vaguely interesting. You need to be aware of the fact that this is one of the pitfalls of your flat organization, is that people are naturally will feel inclined to leave it.
Anybody
It's
else?
true. I think people are, there's a tendency to reinvent the same system and just call it something different. We see that in history. Russia and China both in the 20th century had tremendous revolutions, but they're right back to where they were. China's headed by an emperor, whatever he's called, and so is Russia. It's the same hierarchy with the people at the bottom with no power. They just call it different things. Reinventing everything down to the ground is very difficult.
I think it's mostly you have to be self-aware that, there's a set of, self-perpetuating things that are happening, and that, people are always, some people, not everyone, but some people are always going to want power, and some people are always going to find a way to have it. And so it's kind of, you can't just say, like, by virtue of ideology, we're intrinsically superior and we're not going to fall back into the mistakes of the past. That does not work, right? It kind of continually active, okay, this is the way that we're going forward. And there is a big inertia.
Humans are hierarchical. When there is when something shocking happens and an emergency happens, one of our first reactions is to look for someone to tell us what to do, because we don't know what to do. I first noticed that as a kid when a bad earthquake struck. Everybody was looking for somebody to say, do this. And as soon as a teacher, because I was in school, said, do this, we all did this. Turned out it was wrong. It was the wrong thing to do, but we all did it because we thought it would make safety. And I think that we see that in history over and over. Go ahead.
The open question, how much of that is being self-reinforced by the structures that we're raised in? You mentioned school. How does it go to
Good
school?
question. Good question.
School works
But
with
I've
one
seen it.
up to.
I've seen it in other situations, and I also read it in history. I think there's a tendency to want to follow, to feel helpless. It's hard to take agency. It's hard to get others to listen to us. Go ahead, Ben. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I have the interrupting conversation style, so trying to find the right moment, not too early. I largely agree with your perspective on this, Sherwood, because I see it as emerging from these really sort of fundamental traits of, like, knowing what to do is hard. Like, but if somebody else knows what to do, like in most situations, like that's great. And yeah, I don't know, humans sure seem to mistake confidence for competence a lot.
Yeah.
And like, that's a big thing.
Yes.
Like, if somebody comes up and
Yes.
tells you they know what to do, it's like, fine, because I sure am full of self-doubt because I'm a human being and you seem to know what's going on. So like, let's go with that plan. And it's a very natural reaction. And sometimes it can lead us in bad directions.
It's actually terrible because the people who most likely know what to do are like probably full of self. I mean, most of the experts tend to be like, okay, well, there's this solution, but also this solution and also this solution, right? Generally, when someone is very confident, they don't actually know what the fuck they're doing.
Yeah, it's the Dunning-Kruger effect is a real classic thing where people who understand the problem underrate their expertise, and people who do not understand the problem overrate their expertise because they think it's easy.
Yep. So we all listen to the wrong person, right?
There's a scene in the famous documentary Master and Commander: The Far Side of the World, where Dr. Maturin and Jack Aubrey are having a conversation. It's getting somewhat heated about the limits of authority and right and wrong in the context of a Royal Navy frigate. And Jack loses his temper, and in the idiom of the 19th century says, men must be governed. Sometimes unwisely, yes, but they must be governed. That notion that this may be a total shit show, this may be a shambolic horror, but any form of authority is absolutely better than having none at all. I think is something that haunts us, has haunted us for as long as we've been a species, and will continue to haunt us for some time. Just the notion that it's interesting how that starts out as sort of a half admission of guilt, that oftentimes, we are not governed wisely and we do not govern ourselves in a judicious manner, and rapidly becomes a justification. Governing ourselves in a judicious manner is not possible because we are flawed, and therefore all of this nonsense and misery we inflict upon one another is merely what we can expect from the human condition. So suck it up, snowflake, and don't expect to change anything. I find that to be a perfect little capsulization of so many of a recurring problem that just keeps popping up over and over and over and over again. Better things are not possible. Resign yourself to misery. That's just the way we are.
That's why I write young adult books, because we don't resign ourselves to misery.
Right. Well, I think we're all afraid of chaos. Going back to Stephen Maturin, he saw the French Revolution and what happens when you loose the chaos of the crowd on people. It destroys everything in its way.
I mean, it's the sad truth that most revolutions actually are very bloody and very destructive, and if you take it from a sheer individual point of view, generally a net loss. A generation later, arguably, we might be doing better, but during the 20 years of the actual revolution, never pretty.
Well, and I think this begs the question of, can you have systemic change without anarchy? And I do think, or a revolution that is so deeply full of loss. And I think that's where we have to stop pretending it's a zero-sum game of you have to live with the misery as it is, or go through a miserable revolution where half your friends die and there's disaster for 20 years before things get better. And often we're presented with this kind of dichotomy of like, you know, either it is the way it is, or it's all going to go to hell before it can get better. And I don't think that's in any way accurate. It is absolutely the way many countries and kingdoms and forms of governance have gone down in the past, but I don't think it's the only way to create change.
I mean, it's worth noting that they mostly got there through refusing change.
So I'm not much of a historian, so I don't know of any real world examples that have done this right, at least in any lasting fashion. But I certainly, there's history's full of these examples of where a loss of stability creates something even worse than or as bad as or worse than the terrible dictatorship that preceded it. See like, you know, Syria,
French Revolution.
Libya, and right, but like just
The
in the last
terror was
couple of
worse
years,
than the
in
king.
the last
Yeah.
and in the last 5 years, you can find, you know, examples. But what a thing that feels like a solution, if it were to exist in real life, which I don't know, is having these bottom up, having something other than chaos to take its place, having these bottom up structures that people have been trying to organize, be there to fill in some of these gaps of, so that it's not simply like, you know, we've torn the strong man down and now we're just, you know, everyone's dying for the scraps.
You could see some of it in emergency situations where the community starts to fix things as a community. They all know each other. They're all in it together. They pitch in and they start taking care of the problem. From the top down, history's not so good on that front.
I highly suggest anybody who has not read it read Rebecca Solnit's Paradise Built in Hell.
Built in Hell, yeah.
Response to emergencies and how in fact it's, you know, it is not chaos and anarchy by and large happening.
Yeah, there's also been, I mean, at least in the United States, and I presume in other places as well, in the last couple of years, there's been a relatively increased amount of work being done to create community level mutual support organizations in a way that is totally disconnected from formal civic authority and its funding mechanisms and its decision making mechanisms. You know, to simply enhance the ability of you know, groups of people, groups of citizens, groups of neighbors to you know, survive together civil unrest or natural unrest or authoritarian crackdowns. And it's that that parallelism that I find most interesting. You know, because like I said, it is intrinsically meant to be totally disparate from, you know, any government entity, any elected force. But that may be, we've hit several topics that are definitely in the realm of, but that's another panel entirely. And also we are coming up on the end of our allotted time, even extended as it is. So what I would like to do is have each of you wonderful people give us just like a, you know, 1 minute or so final thoughts, closing summation, you know, threats of death and destruction, whatever you want to do with your minute is typically cool with us. And we will go in reverse order as I see you on my little screen. So we'll go Sherwood to Intisar to Aliette to Benjamin. So Sherwood.
Oh, I was trying to think of book recommendations. Just move on.
Also, for book recommendations, we can use the Discord channel to leave notes on this all over the place. And I figured that would probably just be easier than putting us all on the spot as to books we might want to mention. So don't fret about it too much, but I will come back to you. Intisar?
You know, closing thoughts, I think it's just really important as writers and authors and even as readers to engage with stories that that challenge the status quo of heroes' journeys and this kind of chosen one narrative, and to think about what the world can look like and how groups of people can work together, and recognize that it's a very complex story. It create nuance where those other stories really don't have any, and that's much more real to our world. So, you know, it's just do it. You know, keep trying. It's not necessarily easy, especially if you're starting out writing, but it is very rewarding, and you're bringing something really important.
All righty, Aliette.
Well, mostly going to echo what Intisar was saying. I'm also going to add to it and say that, I mean, we as authors don't necessarily have a sacred, you know, it's not like everything we say is going to like influence people immediately, but I think it's just part of a body of texts that is being produced and that does influence people. So in that sense, we do have individual responsibility, and it's up to us what we do with it. And I personally think of it as trying to do things responsibly and thoughtfully. And insofar as possible, when something happens in the book, it's because I did it deliberately rather than because I didn't think about it at all, right? And I just happened to hit the first cliche that was in the brain. I think it's also worth consuming media more widely, especially media that does not come from within the West, or that comes from different storytelling traditions within the West as well. So more narratives by marginalized people in particular, and by people of different descents and nationalities and countries.
All righty, Ben.
I used my last minute to tell you, for a metaphor, or actually tell you a science fact of great metaphorical value. You have heard, perhaps, of alpha wolves and beta wolves, and many people use this structure of like alphas as this social thing in humans. Alpha wolves are not real. That is a myth based on studying wolves in captivity that has, like, what's actually happening in wolf packs in the wild is like, there are families and the alpha is the dad, and like and this whole idea of there being like this struggle for dominance and the dominant alpha wolf is just complete bullshit and does not at all represent the real world. I'll make sure to post the link in the Discord.
I love how you had to pause briefly and touch your head and summon the strength, like your brain had thrown a gear, like, you gotta talk about it.
Yeah.
All righty. Sherwood, you have a chance to pound the last nail in the coffin.
Okay. I think every writer is going to have a different way to say these things, but looking at the history of classic literature everywhere, you find that there's a tension between life as it is and life as it could be. And the story that works really well and brings people back to it is working out how to get to the way life could be. And it's surprising going back, looking at the history of literature to see what is normal in the life as it could be. Life, normal for us now actually wasn't when the book was written. And so I think that's what we as science fiction and fantasy writers are doing sometimes, is showing through demonstrating through storytelling how life could be and how to get there.
All right. Well, the Grim Reaper has appeared in the form of Casey in her little window, which signals that it is time to end. Panelists, Sherwood, Intisar, Aliette, and Ben, you have all been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. And I believe that's going to be the
for joining us,
end of our panel.
And thank you for everyone who tuned in for virtual 4th Street 21, and we hope to see you at the con next year.
Yes. Scott, you were awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, this was delightful.
And thanks, Casey and Devin.
Thank you.
All right. I will deactivate the exploding ankle bracelets, so you are all free to go. I mean, what? I didn't say that out loud. You've always been free to go.